Forget what Hollywood wants you to believe about tank warfare. Most films get it completely wrong. Cramped interiors, magically spacious, engines whisper quiet, and armor somehow bulletproof against everything. But a handful of films actually got veterans nodding in approval. Let's talk about 10 war films veterans say absolutely nailed the tanks. Fury? Fury got tank combat. So right, it's almost disturbing. David Ayer's 2014 film follows a Sherman tank crew led by Brad Pitt in the final days of World War II, and it's one of those rare movies where the director obsessed over every detail. The production team actually used the last operational Tiger I tank in the world from the Bovington Tank Museum in England. That thing is the real deal, not some dressed-up prop. What makes Fury stand out is how claustrophobic it feels inside that Sherman. Veterans who served in tanks say that cramped, sweaty, terrifying experience is exactly what they remember. The loader struggling to ram shells while the tank's rocking side to side. The commander screaming orders nobody can hear over the engine. The constant smell of cordite, oil, and fear. The final battle sequence, where the crew faces a vastly superior German Tiger tank, got major praise from military advisors. They captured the pure panic of being outgunned, outarmored, and having to use strategy over firepower. And that mud. Tanks don't just drive anywhere they want. They get stuck, they break down, they need constant maintenance. One veteran who served in Desert Storm said watching Fury gave him actual anxiety flashbacks to being locked in a metal box while under fire. Even the German Tank Veteran Association praised the film's technical accuracy. When both sides of a conflict say, "You got it right," you know you've done something special. Lebanon. Lebanon might be the most claustrophobic war film ever made. Shot almost entirely from inside a single Israeli tank during the 1982 Lebanon War, this film won the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival and got universal praise from Israeli tank veterans. Director Samuel Maoz based it on his own experiences as a gunner, and that authenticity bleeds through every frame. The entire movie takes place inside the tank, with the outside world only visible through the gunner's scope. A brilliant directorial choice that makes you feel trapped alongside the crew. The actors were literally jammed into a replica tank interior for weeks of filming, and it shows in their performances. No Hollywood comfort here. What veterans specifically praise is how the film captures the psychological toll of tank warfare. The constant mechanical failures, the heat that has the crew dripping with sweat, the confusion of not knowing what's happening outside. One Israeli veteran said watching it felt like reliving my nightmares. The sound design deserves special mention. The deafening engine noise, the metallic screeching when the turret rotates, and the horrifying boom when shells hit the armor. Maoz didn't sugarcoat anything. He showed tanks for what they really are. Not invincible war machines, but vulnerable metal coffins filled with terrified young men. The scene where the crew has to deal with bodily functions while under fire might make viewers uncomfortable, but veterans called it the most honest portrayal they'd ever seen. As one put it, war is disgusting, and nobody talks about having to pee in a bottle while enemies are trying to kill you. The Beast. The Beast is hands down the most underrated tank movie ever made. Released in 1988, it follows a Soviet T-55 tank crew that gets separated from their unit during the Soviet-Afghan War. What makes this film special is how it portrays the T-55 not as some unstoppable Russian monster, but as a flawed, maintenance-heavy machine that's simultaneously powerful and vulnerable. Director Kevin Reynolds got his hands on real T-55 tanks for filming, and veterans who operated them say the details are spot on. The startup sequence, the manual turret controls, the way the crew has to coordinate loading and firing, it's all there. One Russian tank commander who saw the film said, "They got the smell right. That mix of diesel, gun oil, and human sweat that never leaves you." The film doesn't shy away from showing how tanks can be defeated. When Afghan fighters attempt to take out the tank using RPGs, the tactics are terrifyingly accurate. They aim for the tracks, the rear engine compartment, and the vulnerable points that real guerrilla fighters would target. The scene where Afghan fighters use a primitive but effective trap to immobilize the tank had Vietnam-era tank veterans nodding in agreement. What really sets the beast apart is how it portrays the psychological impact of being inside a tank in hostile territory. Jason Patric's character slowly unravels as the tank becomes both their only protection and their prison. The claustrophobia, the heat, the constant fear of ambush. Veterans say that mental strain is exactly what tank warfare does to you. It's brutal, honest, and probably why it didn't do well at the box office. Too real for comfort. Patton might be best known for George C. Scott's iconic performance, but tank veterans point to it as one of the most accurate portrayals of World War II armored warfare ever filmed. The 1970 epic, directed by Franklin J. Schaffner, features some of the most realistic tank battle sequences of its era, particularly the North African campaign scenes where American tanks fought Rommel's forces. What makes these sequences stand out is that they used actual tanks from the period, not props or dressed-up modern vehicles. The production managed to source M48 Patton tanks to stand in for the Sherman tanks and modified them to look period-accurate. For the German side, they used M47 Pattons painted in Afrika Korps colors to represent German Panzer IVs. Tank veterans who served in the Korean and Vietnam Wars immediately recognized the authentic movements and maneuvers. The Battle of El Guetar sequence particularly impressed military advisors. The film accurately portrays how Patton positioned his tanks on high ground with the sun behind them to blind German gunners, a tactic the real Patton employed. The film also gets right how tank commanders had to stand exposed in the turret to properly direct their units, despite the extreme danger. One veteran M60 tank commander noted, "What Patton got right that most films miss is the importance of terrain in tank warfare." Tanks don't just rush at each other in open fields. It's all about using hills, depressions, and natural features for advantage. The film also correctly shows how tanks operate as part of combined arms operations, working alongside infantry and aircraft rather than fighting alone. Though made decades ago, Patton remains a benchmark for realistic tank combat that many modern films still fail to match. T-34. T-34 might look like a typical Russian propaganda film on the surface, but veterans say this 2018 action thriller gets a shocking amount right about its legendary namesake tank. The film follows a T-34 tank crew that escapes a Nazi prison camp in their captured Soviet tank. While the plot goes full Hollywood, the tank sequences are surprisingly authentic. The production team went all out on accuracy. They used real restored T-34/85 tanks and Panzer IIIs for filming, not CGI or mock-ups. The interiors are meticulously recreated, showing the cramped conditions of the Soviet design. One Russian tank instructor said, "They even got the startup sequence correct, something almost every other film gets wrong." The mechanical details are spot on. The manual turret traverse that required the gunner to literally crank a wheel by hand, the loader cramming massive 85mm shells into the breech, and the commander having to stand up through the hatch to see anything. What veterans praise most is how the film portrays the T-34's legendary strengths and weaknesses. The sloped armor that could deflect German shells at certain angles, the powerful gun that could penetrate Panzer armor, but also the terrible visibility, the lack of radios in early models, and the frequent mechanical breakdowns. The scene where the crew has to repair their own track under fire was described by one veteran as bringing back memories I'd rather forget. The battle scenes show authentic tactics too. The German tanks trying to hit the T-34's vulnerable sides while the Soviet crew keeps their front armor facing the enemy. Even the way shells ricochet or penetrate is surprisingly accurate. Despite its action movie excesses, T-34 actually taught audiences more about real tank warfare than a dozen Hollywood blockbusters. Kelly's Heroes. Kelly's Heroes might be a heist movie disguised as a war film, but tank veterans consistently praise it for having some of the most authentic tank sequences of any World War II movie. This 1970 Clint Eastwood classic follows a group of American soldiers who go AWOL to steal Nazi gold, and along the way features some seriously accurate tank action. What makes this film stand out is that director Brian G. Hutton used actual tanks, not props. The production filmed in Yugoslavia, where the Army still had functioning Sherman tanks and even provided Soviet T-34s modified to look like German Tigers. These weren't miniatures or mock-ups. They were multi-ton war machines rumbling across the landscape. The scene where the Sherman tanks first encounter the German Tiger is considered by many veterans to be one of the most realistic depictions of the terror American crews felt when facing superior German armor. Don Rickles' character, Crap Game, delivers a line that tank veterans say is spot on. To a New Yorker like you, a hero is some type of weird sandwich. This cynical attitude perfectly captures the gallows humor of real tank crews. The film also nails the constant maintenance required, showing crews working on thrown tracks and engine problems rather than just driving endlessly without issues. What really impressed veterans was the accurate portrayal of tank weaknesses. When the crew discusses how to take out the Tiger, they correctly identify its vulnerable points, the rear armor and the tracks. The final showdown in the town square shows realistic urban tank tactics, with the Sherman using its mobility advantage in the confined space. One Vietnam-era tank commander said, "That scene taught me more about urban tank combat than my actual training did." White Tiger. White Tiger is probably the strangest tank film ever made, but Russian veterans insist it's also one of the most technically accurate. This 2012 Russian film, directed by Karen Shakhnazarov, blends war drama with supernatural elements, following a badly burned Soviet tank commander who believes he's been chosen to hunt down a mysterious, seemingly invincible German Tiger tank. Despite its mystical storyline, the film's tank sequences are remarkably authentic. The production used real T-34s, IS-2s, and even built a full-scale working Tiger tank replica that weighs 15 tons. The attention to detail is obsessive, from the exact engine sounds, recorded from museum pieces, to the way the turrets traverse at historically accurate speeds. One Russian tank instructor said, "I use clips from this film to teach recruits about World War II tank tactics. What veterans particularly praise is how the film captures the psychological aspects of tank warfare, the constant fear of ambush, the split-second decisions that mean life or death, and the strange bond between crews and their machines." The film shows how Soviet tank crews would often name their tanks and develop almost supernatural beliefs about them, something documented in real wartime accounts but rarely shown on screen. The combat sequences are technically perfect. The film accurately portrays how tanks of that era fought, not in open duels but through ambush and maneuver. The scene where a T-34 attempts to flank the Tiger by using a burning building as cover was described by one veteran as exactly the kind of desperate tactic we were taught. Even the loading sequences are correct, showing the physically demanding process of ramming shells into the breech while the tank is in motion. White Tiger might be too mystical for some Western audiences, but its technical accuracy has made it required viewing at Russian tank academies. Sahara. Sahara is that rare beast, a wartime propaganda film that veterans say got the technical details surprisingly right. This 1943 film starring Humphrey Bogart follows an American tank crew stranded in the Libyan desert during the North African campaign. What makes it remarkable is that it was made while the war was still raging, with technical advice from soldiers who had actually fought in the campaign just months earlier. The tank featured is an M3 Lee, and the film accurately portrays its strengths and limitations. The awkward design with its side-mounted 75mm gun and limited traverse is shown exactly as it was, a stopgap tank rushed into production that American crews had to make the best of. One veteran who served in an M3 said, "They got the blind spots right." We really couldn't see anything coming from certain angles. The desert conditions are portrayed with brutal honesty. The film shows the tank overheating, the crew suffering from dehydration, and the constant maintenance required to keep the tracks from being jammed with sand. These weren't Hollywood inventions, but real problems tank crews faced in North Africa. The scene where the crew has to ration their remaining water was described by Desert Campaign veterans as painfully accurate. What's most impressive is how the film portrays actual tactics used in the campaign. When the crew sets up their disabled tank as a stationary gun position, they're employing a real tactic used by Allied forces when tanks became immobilized. The final battle scene, where they use the tank's position on high ground to hold off a much larger German force, is based on actual combat reports from the campaign. Despite being made as a morale-boosting war film, Sahara's commitment to technical accuracy makes it hold up better than many more recent productions. The Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge takes some serious liberties with history, but tank veterans still point to it as getting key technical aspects of armored warfare right. This 1965 epic, directed by Ken Anakin, focuses on the massive tank battles of Germany's last major offensive in December 1944. While historians criticize its compressed timeline and fictional characters, tank crews praise its depiction of winter tank operations. What the film gets surprisingly right is the difficulty of operating tanks in extreme cold. It shows engines that won't start, frozen tracks that snap under stress, and the brutal conditions for crews in unheated metal boxes. One veteran who served in Korea said, "That scene where they have to light fires under the engines to warm them enough to start?" We did exactly that. The film also correctly portrays how poor visibility in snow conditions completely changes tank tactics. The production used Spanish Army M47 Patton tanks modified to look like German Tigers and M24 Chaffee light tanks dressed up as Shermans. While not perfect replicas, the film captures how these machines actually moved through terrain, the suspension bouncing over rough ground, the tracks throwing snow, and the limitations in climbing steep slopes. The scene where tanks slip and slide on icy roads was singled out by veterans as something they experienced but rarely see in films. Director Ken Anakin also nailed the strategic aspects of tank warfare. The German tank commander, played by Robert Shaw, correctly explains the importance of capturing fuel depots, the actual limiting factor in the historical offensive. The film also shows how aerial reconnaissance was crucial in locating enemy tank formations, something often overlooked in other war films. Despite its historical inaccuracies, The Battle of the Bulge remains one of the few films to correctly portray the brutal realities of winter tank operations. Saints and Soldiers, The Void. Saints and Soldiers. The Void doesn't have the budget or fame of other films on this list, but tank veterans consistently praise this 2014 indie film for its surprising technical accuracy. Set during the final days of World War II, it follows an American tank crew operating a Stuart light tank behind enemy lines. What makes this low-budget film stand out is that the production team got their hands on an actual functioning M5 Stuart tank and showed it exactly as it was, underpowered, undergunned, but fast and reliable. The film correctly portrays the Stuart's 37mm gun as nearly useless against German armor, forcing the crew to rely on speed and ambush tactics. One veteran who trained on similar light tanks said, "They got the feel of the Stuart perfect. It drove more like a sports car than a tank." The film excels in showing the day-to-day reality of tank operations that bigger movies ignore. The constant maintenance, the crew sleeping on and around their vehicle, and the peculiar habits each tank develops, like a stubborn turret that sticks at certain angles. These small details resonated with veterans who lived with these machines for months on end. What impressed technical advisors most was the accuracy of the crew positions and procedures. The film shows the correct loading sequence for the 37mm gun, the proper communications protocols between crew members, and even the accurate use of the tank's auxiliary systems. The scene where the crew has to repair a thrown track under fire was described by one veteran as bringing back memories so accurate I could almost smell the grease. Director Ryan Little shot the film in Utah, with a budget that wouldn't cover craft services on a Hollywood production, yet veterans say he captured the essence of tank warfare better than films costing 100 times more. Want to share your thoughts on which films got tank warfare right or wrong? Drop your opinions in the comments below. And here's a question that always sparks debate among veterans. Was the Sherman tank really a death trap like Fury suggests, or was it actually the perfect balance of reliability and mass production? Let me know what you think, and remember, for every realistic tank film, there are 20 others that make actual tank crews laugh themselves silly.